Today I'm going to show you the basic settings for the X1T radio trigger so that you can start using your Godox flashes off camera. And I happen to have a Godox TT350 and a Godox AD200 that I'll be using in our demonstration. And I think the best way to start really is just start talking about the basic features of this unit, give you a little illustration of what those features are for, and then we'll go into the settings that you need on the trigger, on the camera, and then on the flash. So the radio trigger just fires the flashes via a radio signal, and this trigger has 32 different channels that it can transmit on, so you just need to pick one. So if I pick channel 1 on the trigger, I just need to make sure any flashes I want to fire with this trigger need to be on channel 1. And the reason you have so many different channels is sometimes, maybe you're at a wedding and you have a second photographer doing additional photos and you're both using Godox triggers. And you want to make sure that you're on different channels so you're not inadvertently firing each other's flashes. Now, the other feature of this flash is that it can control up to 5 groups of flashes. And each group can have as many flashes as you want. It can be 1, it can be 5 flashes on each group. And each group can be controlled individually in terms of power output, whether you choose a TTL or you're going to choose manual power modes. And all of this can be set up in the flash while you're standing behind the camera, and then do a few test shots just to make sure that all the lighting's correct. So let's walk through a scenario where you'll be using different groups, because I think once you kind of understand what, an example of how these groups work, it'll be easier to understand how to set everything up when you're in the trigger. Alright, so let's just set up our flash. We're going to be on channel 1, and I'm going to be doing a portrait session, so I think I'll just use 3 different groups of flashes. So we're going to have a group A, group B, and a group C. And like I said, each group can be controlled independently. So you can have TTL, or you can control them manually. And let's say our model is standing here, like so, and then we have a little backdrop right here. And for the lighting setup, I'm going to do a typical butterfly lighting setup in the front, where I'll have a flash up here, and then I'm going to point a flash from down here, and then I'm going to set up one flash behind the model, like so, to provide like a rim lighting, to give a nice outline to the model to help separate the background. And like for the background, like I've illustrated here, there's a, we'll just say this is a black background or gray background, something like this. And I'm going to put a flash here on the floor, like so, and point it at the backdrop. And then I'm going to put just a blue gel on top so that when the flash fires, it'll give the background a nice blue kind of color. So the way I want to control these flashes, I'm going to group them into different groups. So I'm going to have the flashes in the front illuminating the model in group A, like so. And then the rim lighting, I'm going to call this group B. And then for the backdrop with the blue gel, we'll just put this in the group C. And I think for group A, what I want to happen is I'll just let the camera determine the exposure. So I'm just going to leave those in TTL mode. So group A, I'm going to set to TTL. And then group B, which is just this one single flash, for the rim lighting, I'm going to set that at full power. So we're going to be in manual mode at full power, which will be 1/1. And then for group C, which is just a blue background, I'm going to set that at maybe 1/4 power in manual mode. Mainly because you know, if it's too strong, if I put it at full power, it'll probably be too bright and look white and not give me that blue color I was looking for. So I think quarter power should be about right. And then once I set all that up on the trigger, I just take a test shot and look at the image, and if it's the exposure that I'm looking for, we're done. But usually you have to make some adjustments, right? So what I might do is go on the back of the trigger and say, you know, the TTL, I have these two flashes here. They're a little bit too strong or a little bit too bright. So I'm going to reduce the exposure on the group A, which is in TTL mode, but I'll just do that via exposure comp on the trigger. So I'm just going to dial in -1 stop and see how that looks. And then on group B, I thought that, you know, maybe I noticed the flash was a little bit too bright and causing a little bit of glaring over the entire image. So what I'll do is probably reduce this one down to half power. And then the blue light for the background, group C, that looked pretty good. The blue was right at about the right color and brightness that I wanted for the overall image. So I would make all those settings on the trigger, take another test shot and see how that looks. And if that looked good, we're done. Then all I have to do is really just work with the model for different positions and things. So let me show you how to set this up on the radio trigger as we outlined. And then I'll show you what settings you need to do on the flash, and then we'll go on to the camera. All right, so the first thing we need to do is just turn the trigger on like so. And we're not going to be using high-speed sync today. I'll save that maybe for another video. So we're going to leave this switch off. This is the high-speed sync switch to turn on and off. And then we'll just simply mount it onto the camera. Tighten it down like so. And let me just turn the camera on. So on the camera, we'll just have this on auto mode, auto ISO, auto white balance, etc. We'll just let the camera do most of the work. And when the camera's flash mode is set to auto, it's simply just going to trigger the wireless trigger to trigger the flashes. Now on the back of the X1T, you need to look at just a few things here. First, we have this little white arrow that's kind of painted on here. And that's going to be pointing to a row on the back of the LCD screen. And then on the LCD screen, you need to think of this as columns and rows. So we have the first column here. Hopefully you can see this. Let me see if I can turn the display on. The first column here are the group letters. So you have A, B, C, D, E. So you have 5 groups. There's another column here where you see, like right here, you'll see TTL, and down here you'll see the M for manual mode. So this is the mode column. And then the next column here, this third column, are the settings for the mode. So right now the TTL is at -2 exposure compensation, and group B here is in manual mode with the power output at 1/128. So it's set at its lowest power. And then this next area in here are just icons for various settings, but the first one is right up in here. It tells us what channel we're on. So we're just going to stay in channel 1 and put all the flashes on channel 1. But I'll show you how to change the channel when we get to the buttons here. So the buttons here, we have the channel button and OK button. This is the group button. And then finally we have the mode button. And then next to that we have the wheel to adjust settings or to go through the different groups. And that's all there is there. So in our diagram we had group A set to TTL. So what we would have to do is just scroll. If it's not on group A here next to this arrow, which is what we're on, you could just roll through all the different groups until you come back to the letter A. And then the next column here, we're already in TTL mode. But if I needed to change that, I would just click the mode button like so. So you can see now the group A is changed to manual mode at full power. And now group A has been turned off because there's a double dash line here. And then if I click the mode button again, it goes to TTL. So this mode button simply toggles through the different modes for the group that you're in. So again, we'll leave this on TTL. And then the next column is what the TTL is set at. And as we did in the diagram, I didn't have any exposure comp dialed in, so I need to change this. And the way I change this is I click the group button, and now you'll see the -2 blinking, and then I just use the dial until this goes back to 0, like so. And now we need to set up group B, so we'll just go up with the wheel to group B. It's already in manual mode, so all we have to do is change the power output, and I started at full power at 1/1. So what do? I hit the group button, and now the power is blinking, and I just adjust the wheel, and I'm just rolling it up until I get to full power, like so, and then I hit the group button to stop. And then let's go up to group C, change the mode, because now group C is off. I can turn this on by the mode button, and it wasn't TTL, it was also in manual. And I think I had the power set to, I think it was 1/4. Yeah, so group B was at 1/4, but if it wasn't, it would be easy enough to change it here. And then once I get to 1/4 power, I just hit the group button again to lock that in. And then we'll just make sure that group D is off and group E is off, and then I'll go back to group A. So the next thing is, if the trigger was not already on channel 1 as indicated here, it's easy enough to change by just holding the channel button here, which is the top button, for 2 seconds until it starts blinking. And now you see the channel numbers blinking, and then we do what? We just roll the wheel until we get to the channel number we want. So we'll just put this back to channel 1, like so, and then we'll click the channel button again, and we're all set. So now the trigger has been set up to fire the flashes like I did in scenario 1. So all we have to do is set up the 3 flashes. And I'm just going to do set up the first one, group A, and then group B and C should be obvious. Alright, so before we get started with the flash, you just need to know if the Godox model that you have can act as a transmitter receiver or master slave mode as they call it. And the Godox TT350 does have that capability, so we need to make sure that the Godox TT350 flash is in slave mode and the radio is on and it's on the right channel. So let's just turn it on, like so. And if you're looking at the back of the screen, you should already see that it is in, the radio trigger is on as indicated by this little antenna, that it is in slave mode, and it's on channel mode, channel 1. And then over here we have the group number, that it's in group A. So for the first flash, everything looks about right here. It's also in TTL mode, and it's the zoom head's been set to 24 millimeters, which is something I forgot to mention, but you can control the zoom via the wireless trigger, but it's a lot easier to do it just directly on the flash. So we're not going to worry about that. But let me show you how to set all of these if this is not what's showing on your flash already. So if I want to turn the radio on and off, I just hold the sync button for 2 seconds and the antenna will start blinking, and then all I have to do is rotate the wheel. So now the radio trigger is off because there's no icons next to the radio antenna. And if I turn the wheel again, it's in slave mode channel 1. If I turn the wheel again, it's in master mode channel 1, and that's not what we want. So we want to be in slave mode, so we're going to rotate the wheel until we get to that, and just click the set button. So now we have the radio trigger on set to slave channel 1, which matches channel 1 on the radio trigger. And I know that I'm in group A here because it defaults to group A first, but if I need to change the group, all I have to do is click the slave button over here, because underneath you'll see in fine print channel, group and channel icons here. And another thing I'm noticing here is that the TT350 is limited to be in one of 3 groups, A, B, or C, because as I'm toggling through the different groups, it only goes to A, B, and C. So if you have 5 groups of flashes, just know that the weakest link is going to be the TT350, and it needs to be an A, B, or C. But you may have another flash from Godox. I'm not sure if the 8200 goes that far, but they may have 5 groups built in, 16 groups, etc. All right, then the zoom. All right, now the zoom by default is normally set to auto, which is fine for most cases, but if you want to set it specifically, and again, it's easier to do it directly on the flash than through the trigger in this case, you just click the zoom button once and then you rotate the wheel to change the zoom head. So I'm just going to leave it at 24 millimeters, the widest. But if you see AU, it's in auto mode, and it's not going to do anything in auto mode. It's just going to be stuck at roughly a 28 millimeter zoom. So I'm going to set it to 24 millimeters and just click the set button. And that's all we need to do here. Now this says TTL now by default, but even if it was in manual mode, for example, if I send a test shot, if I click the button on top of the radio trigger here, no matter what mode the flash in, it's going to revert to whatever the radio trigger is telling it to do. So just watch closely. I'm going to change the mode to manual mode, and then if I do a test shot, you'll see that it jumps back to TTL mode. So you don't need to worry about what's up in the top left corner. And that's all there is to setting this flash to be in group A. And then the next flash, you do all of the same things, except the only thing different you're going to do is you're going to change this letter to be group B. So now this flash will do whatever group B is supposed to do via the trigger. And then for the third flash, or the third group C, you would just change it by clicking the slave button to be group C. And if I had 4 of these flashes, I would set 2 of these to group A, 1 to group B, and 1 to group C. And that would match exactly what I drew in the diagram. Now the next thing then I would take a test shot. Then the next thing I would do would be I take the test shot like I said, and I thought it was too bright. All I'd have to do to dial exposure comp in is hit the group button, and then you'll see the exposure compensation number blinking, and then I would just dial in a -1 like so, hit the group button, and then I would roll the wheel next to group B, and I would change this to half power. So I hit the group button and I roll this down to half power like so, and then I check group C, and it's at 1/4 power, and we didn't make any changes there. And then I would just hit the shutter button and take the picture and look at the image and see if that was correct. So that's really all there is to it. And if you're just working with one flash, you don't really have to turn off all the other groups, but it's just a good habit to do so. So I would just roll this over to group B and change the mode to turn that off. Then go to group C and turn that off. And now the only flash that's going to trigger are the ones that are in group A. And in this case, I only have 1 flash. So I would make sure that the flash I'm using is in group A like so. And then I'll just do a test shot just to make sure it goes into TTL mode. And that's how I would set up this trigger to match that diagram. Alright, so let's look at some of the camera settings that can affect how this trigger operates. So we'll go into the super control panel, and as you know, we were shooting with the flash mode set to auto. And if I change this to red eye, it's not going to do anything. The red eye function does not work with this trigger. And all red eye does is fire the flash once before it actually takes the picture to reduce the people's pupils, I guess. But just know that that doesn't actually work with the radio trigger. Then the next option is the flash mode, is the fill-in mode. And if I just click OK here, you'll see that it says fill-in. And fill-in is exactly the same as auto, except that it's going to fire every single time, which auto does anyway. And then we have the flash off. Now, if I put this in flash off, it's not going to tell the trigger to fire. So you may or may not see this not flash. It's kind of funny to say that, but the flash did not fire when I have the flash mode turned off in the camera. And then we have slow sync with red eye. That doesn't work, so don't use the red eye. Then we have slow sync without red eye, and that just allows you to shoot a lower shutter speed. So you'll see that the shutter speed dropped down to 8 seconds, or 1/8 of a second. That works fine. And then you have second curtain slow sync, and that works fine. That just fires the flash at the end of the exposure before the curtain closes, whereas slow sync just fires the flash at the beginning of the exposure. The last thing here, it just goes back to auto again. Now just below that is the exposure compensation for the flash. Now this does affect how the trigger works. So right now, for example, I have a -1 dialed into group A. And if I dial in a +1 exposure comp in the camera, it's going to offset the -1. So you have to add these two together. Another thing you have to be careful of is when you're using manual mode on the trigger, telling the flash to shoot in manual mode, the settings in the camera, because, and I'll show you what happens here. The camera is not going to know what you set the flash power at, so it's going to expose for the image as if it didn't have a flash on it. So I have my single Godox TT350 on group A, and I'm going to go ahead and change it to manual mode, and we're going to dial in, and it's already set there at minus, I'm sorry, not minus, but we're at the lowest power setting, 1/128th. And if I just take a picture here, you would think it should be pretty dark, but watch what happens. You can see that the image is way overexposed. And because what happened is, because the camera didn't know what the power of the flash is, it just exposed for the image as if it didn't have a flash. So what it did is, and if you look at the info on the camera, it bumped the ISO up to 1600 to match the shutter speed of 1/60th of a second. So the way you overcome that is you have to manually set the ISO or the aperture or the shutter speed so that you get the exposure you want. And that gets a little bit more complicated if you're not comfortable with setting things manually, but I'll just do a simple one for you. Let's lock the ISO at 200, and we'll leave this in auto, like so. And we'll leave the flash at 1/128th power, and take a picture again and see what happens. Yeah, and that looks about right, what I was expecting. Still a little bit bright, but I can probably compensate that by going to ISO low. Try one more time. And that looks a lot closer to the original TTL exposure with a -1 exposure comp. So with little practice, even if you only have one flash, you should be able to get pretty proficient at using this trigger for multiple groups of flashes at different power settings, whether they're in TTL or manual. And then as you expand in your photography and start buying more flash heads, you won't have any problem controlling them. So hopefully you found this video helpful, and if you have any questions, just let me know in the comments below.